So, looking at Mexican history from around the mid 20th century, I wanted to open up with just talking about these two characters, Octavio Paz and Elena Garro. Both write famous books um, in Mexico. Both traveled to Spain actually around the time of the Spanish Civil War. And Paz arguably is the more famous of the two, even though Garro is considered one of the greatest Mexican women writers. She wrote books, plays, is actually somewhat caught up into the massacre that happened in 1968, um, and was divorced from Paz by that time. Um, but Paz is probably the most recognizable Mexican writer in history. As he has a big influence as a poet and as an essayist. The thing with Paz, that we'll see with other figures, is just how often these men of letters would be involved in as with the state as ambassadors. In fact, famously, Paz revoked that because of the 68 massacre and the student protest. So, um, but Paz was also suspicious of the influence of radical leftist thought coming from Cuba after the 1959 revolution. So he's kind of safely on that side of that equation. That a figure like Krause supported versus someone like Carlos Fuentes. Um, Easily, Octavio Paz's most famous work is The Labyrinth of Solitude, and in some ways, as your textbook talks about, that is the kind of the, I guess, pinnacle point, the pinnacle of the whole like psychological view of history that we saw with goes back to Vasconcelos and even Samuel Ramos. And even though Paz is not really a philosopher, he's a poet, a writer, but he writes so much, and you should get a chance to check out some of his poetry. It would be great. And he wrote a number of essays as well. Um, Gatto, for her part, in some ways, is a someone argues she's a pioneer in the realm of magical realism, especially her book Recollections of Things to Come, which sort of harkens back to that earlier revolution. If you read the chapter um, on culture, you know how much literature is wrestling with the revolution. So that brings us to kind of the late 20th century or mid to late 20th century titans of Mexican literature. Juan Rulfo, who was a photographer and also a writer, but he actually stopped writing at a certain point. His most famous work is Pedro Paramo. Comes out in mid 50s, and some see that novel as the beginning of magical realism because of just how unclear where the dead and the living end. Like there's so much interaction, and the same thing happens with Garo's book. Is this kind of play with linear history, um, and you can see similar even in Carlos Fuentes, his Aura. It's clearly a book where time and living and dead. There's a lot of play with those themes. Fuentes uh, is a pretty big writer globally in some ways. As Mexico's economy and stature in the world, and particularly in Latin America, was growing, so the influence of writers, he kind of he's definitely always listed as one of the boom writers. Him, Gabo, Vargas Llosa, Cortazar. These are all figures in this. in this explosion of Latin American literature across the globe. Um, and and it was intentional to the extent of trying to showcase this art, especially to the European world. He would have a falling out with Octavio Paz and in long ways with Krause as well. And as if you read the chapter, you realize a lot of these people have um, powerful means to express themselves via newspapers and literature. So this is definitely kind of a battle between men of letters in Mexico, especially over kind of, I would say, over the leftist politics during the Cold War. And the funny thing is, because Fuentes is some ways, I think, a little bit to the left of Paz and Krause, and is someone not that far left because there's enough about some of the abuses in the left that he is ready to talk about and condemn. But as kind of a global writer, but intentionally Mexican writer, there is a lot about trying to think again about Mexican culture and identity. He does this clearly in his book Where the Air is Clear. So this comes out in '58, and it is very much kind of in the line of Ramos and Paz's work, and it's probably it puts him on the map, and it just goes to show you this kind of Mexican psychology, but this is now in novel form. Um, he has another book that's really big because it kind of wrestles with the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. This is the death of Artemio Cruz, and again, it's not a linear tale, but it opens up at basically in the present, and then it's a series of reflections about the revolution. So that type of writing, the focus on the revolution, its legacy, is something big, and you can kind of see it as a way of criticizing Pre, right? Because Pre is making a point that they're the party of the revolution, and not everybody's so happy with it. So those are the two Mexican authors. Then you get back to the philosophy. So post-war philosophy um, kind of soaks up the European trends. Some of this you can see in the reaction to Jose Gauss, who is a Spanish philosopher who was exiled or left Spain because of Franco's fascism. He is a proponent of Martin Heidegger's existentialist philosophy. And out of his influence, you get the El Grupo Hyperion, a bunch of young philosophers, up and coming philosophers, and they famously kind of bounce off of the earlier traditions and create, in some ways, the birth of modern Latin American philosophy. So Emilio Oranga was definitely the most famous student of Gauss, and he wrote an analysis of what it means to be lo mexicano. Lo mexicano is kind of this term that's utilized, and what Oranga manages to do is really focus in on Mexican existentialism. So where Gauss is leaning on Heideggerian terms from Heidegger's classic work Being and Time, Oranga is now leaning on the French interpretation of Heidegger. This comes from Jean-Paul Sartre in particular, and even Merleau-Ponty made a visit to Mexico at one point. So you're getting phenomenology and existentialism, which were the rage in Europe, and so now that's coming here in Mexico. But the thing with Mexican philosophy, is it tends to be way more intentionally Mexican. And so there's a quote by that Uranga has citing Jorge Portilla. It is the task is to know and soak up European philosophy and then to philosophize like Latin Americans. And so you see this via Leopoldo Zea in his more philosophy of history. And I personally like Zea's stuff a lot, at least historically, because he tries to answer Hegel's philosophy of history with his own Mexican philosophy of history, um, and try to say like, okay, from the position of Mexico, how do we think about philosophy from our historical entrenched position? So again, you can see a lot of Heidegger and existentialism in this thought, right? To be Dasein, this is a German term from Heidegger. Dasein means to be there, and so this is a very intentional Mexican type of philosophy being promoted, and in some ways trying to combat the Euro Anglo Euro U.S. American centered ness of philosophy. Particularly by trying to look from the viewpoint of Latin America in light of this philosophy of history. Jorge Portilla, in his phenomenology of seriousness, he writes about kind of again the moral decay of the culture, and you can see a heavy influence of Saint Augustine in his thought. So um, he is writing a phenomenology of time and space, but it's one about the gravity of the time period. What I think is kind of fascinating about these philosophers is that, in some ways, they are building up the culture of Mexico at a time period where the economy of Mexico is doing pretty well, at least on the surface level. So let's quickly let me talk about the presidents, the post-war presidents. So Alaman Valdez, the Alaman years, he kind of sets the stage for the quote unquote Mexican economic miracle. So, you know, looking backwards, you'd say like, well, duh, like early 20th century had this huge revolution, and then the kind of recovery from that revolution, especially up to Cardenas. Um, and so, you know, under Alaman, you get this flexing of urbanization and growth of the economy, especially in the building up of Mexican consumer products. So you have this urbanization and this kind of public social structure moving, right? Education, universities, museums, um, different types of industries are building up all around Mexico. However, it's building up around Mexico City, less around, you know, Mexico's big. So all around Mexico City, and these ISIs are really starting to, these import substitution industries are really starting to huddle around Mexico City. So there you kind of see, you know, where the economic miracle, there's holes in the problem. And the other thing is with Alaman, the presidency becomes somewhat of kind of a um, dictatorship of the executive. The party is kind of taking orders from the president. Now, this nobody really cares. I mean, there is an opposition, but as you already know from this class, the opposition takes a while to really do anything. And so everybody's kind of fine with these quote unquote stabilized development during the presidencies of Cortines and Mateos. But it's when you get Diaz Ordaz in his presidency during 64 and 70, it's when Mexico gets sucked up into the student protest. And as you read, the eventual massacre in the October '68. At the same time, Mexico should be proud of itself for hosting the Olympic Games. There's no going back from this point. This is a major um, shift in the way people are going to handle pre and the way Mexican politics is going to move ahead into the rest of 20th century and further ahead.